Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey guys, welcome back to, I think, episode 7. Eventually I'm going to have to stop saying what episode it is because I'm going to lose track. I can't believe it's been 7 episodes already. It's absolutely crazy. Thanks everybody who's been listening. I have a lot of subscribers already. You guys are amazing. I'm not trying to brag. I'm honestly very pleasantly surprised and super, super grateful. So thanks everybody for listening. What you're listening to is True Crime California. This is a podcast about murders and other, criminal activity in the Great Golden State. And I am coming to you during a crazy windstorm. I don't know how many people know, but I live in Los Angeles, in Burbank specifically. And we are having 80 mile an hour wind gusts, which is not normal. We've definitely had windy days before, and even exceptionally windy, but never like this. This is nuts. My back fence just fell over. It's down. It's done. Dunzo. Ripped out of the ground. It's absolutely bonkers. So if you hear some deep rumbling in the background, it's just the wind. It's not my dogs for a change, although it could be them as well. But as of right now, it's the wind, and that shit is loud. I was actually at the Annenberg Beach House today. I'm a caterer, and I was there doing a walkthrough because we're going to start catering weddings and events there, which is amazing. It's literally on the beach in Santa Monica. And while we were there, a brush fire in Pacific Palisades, which is just up on the hill, broke out, and we saw it. And with the wind, it's been spreading. I know people who are having to evacuate. It's just nuts. It really, really sucks. And this year's been really dry. We had 2 years of wet, wet, wet. So everything grew, then it dried out, and now it's going to burn, which is such a bummer. So anybody who's out there, I hope you guys are all okay. To my friends who live in the area, stay safe. And if you need somebody to watch your animals, you know where to find me. Anyway, this week I am doing, as promised, a lesser known case. Now, I didn't explicitly promise that in any previous recordings, but in the description about this podcast, it says that I'm going to do cases that are very well known and cases that are a little bit less well known. And this one, I think, was well known in certain circles, but was fairly new to me. And it does have some TV shows and things, some amount of coverage, but it doesn't have, the same coverage that the Wonderland murders or Polly Klaas have, for instance. So comparatively, pardon me, this is a much less well-known case, but still a really interesting case. And so this week we're doing another case from the 90s. And this is the case of the murder of Debbie Dorian. Debbie Dorian was a 22-year-old college student at Fresno State who was murdered in her apartment in Fresno, California, most likely August 20th, 1996, but unfortunately was not found until 2 days later when she was found by her father, which super sucks. So this is the case of her very tragic death, and it takes some really interesting twists and turns as well. And the most surprising thing, I won't get ahead, but it's an interesting case for sure. So let's just get into it and talk about Debbie and her life and where she lived. One of the things I like about this podcast is I sort of get to talk about the state and the cities. I love California. I love talking about it. I love its history. So it's fun to sort of, discuss the different areas for people who are or are not from around here. Debbie was a third or fourth generation Californian, specifically from Fresno. Now, Fresno is very much in central California. It's surrounded by farm towns and farming. It's pretty rural. Ooh, did you guys hear that? Something just fell over. Okay, sorry guys. My son's basketball hoop just took a dive in the backyard, as did one of my plant holders, but I already got all the plants off of it. So I wasn't lying. It's very, very windy. And now my power is flickering, so let's hope we can record this. Anyway, talking about Fresno. So Fresno is definitely it's in the middle of nowhere, basically. It's in the very middle of California. It's not near the coast. It's not really near anything. And it's interesting because As of 2020, Fresno is the 5th most populous city in the state, which is significant because California is the most populated state in the USA, with about, I think, just over 39 million people. And Fresno has just over 500,000. So just over 500,000 people live in the city. So it's not by any means a small town, but it is sort of in the middle of nowhere, and it's definitely not any sort of tourist attraction. You know, like San Francisco's on the water. They have the ports. They have like all the fun, like the pier, and like, you know, it's just sort of a thing. Los Angeles, I don't think I need to explain. Even Sacramento, it's like a capital city. So Sacramento's kind of gnarly. Having lived, you know, grown up near there, I can say that. But at least, like, it still has a tourist draw. I would say Fresno, Stockton, cities like this that are sort of just in the middle of nowhere, they really don't have any sort of tourism or any sort of draw for anybody who doesn't live there. And this was especially true in the 1990s when Fresno was honestly like a really scary place. Like, I remember growing up and being like, stay away from Fresno. They had a ton of gang activity, ton of violent crimes, property crimes. Things were a bit of a mess. Like, even police at the time were like, yeah, no, things were really bad here in the 90s. Even today, actually, Fresno is way higher than the national average for crime, and also higher than the average in California by like quite a bit. But back then in the 90s, it was even worse. Like I said, I watched this interview with a detective who worked in Fresno in the 90s, and he was like, yeah, our city was completely overrun with crime. So for a cop to admit that, like, it's gotta be bad. Now, that being said, even, you know, back then at this time, there were nice areas in the city, just like anywhere, like any city, even like the hardest cities in the country are going to have like little enclaves, you know, that are kind of safe. And Debbie grew up like a pretty safe and stable home life. You know, she wasn't like out on the streets, you know, she had a fairly normal like suburban childhood. She was a fun, hardworking young woman who graduated from Bullard High School in 1992 and immediately went to college studying economics. Now, her plan upon graduating Fresno State was to go to grad school at San Francisco State College. So, like, just up the road a few hours. So, you know, she very much in control of her life, knew what she wanted to do. She was close with both of her parents. She was very independent. So when she went away to college, she eventually ended up getting an apartment by herself instead of staying at home or living with roommates or, you know, in the dorms, which is funny because Fresno State College is literally less than 5 miles from her high school. So she absolutely could have lived at home while going to college and just chose not to because she was wanting to like start her life. Now, going to Fresno State made a lot of sense. If you live in a city that has like a decent college and you don't have to move away and you don't have to spend the money on like a private school or like a UC or whatever, like it's the best thing to do because you still get a good education and you don't have to pay a ton of money. And again, she stayed in her hometown, which I think is really nice because like transitioning to college can be really scary. You're leaving home, you're leaving everything you've ever known. It's nice to be able to stay in the city where you grew up, you know. But it's interesting because she chose to stay near home, but not stay home. She wanted to have her own life, which I think is really great. So she's 22, which means she's getting towards the end of her undergrad. And things are starting, you know, she wants to go to San Francisco State. She's maybe checking out Sacramento State as well. She's sort of casting a wide net to see where she wants to go to school. Now, on the morning of August 22nd, 1996, her father, Peter, drove to her apartment to check on her because she had not shown up at his house that morning. Their plan was to go to Sacramento State to look at the campus as Debbie, you know, was going to graduate at the end of that year. So she's scouting schools. They're sort of getting ahead of things. Now, she's in August, so she's going to graduate, May or June. If she wants to go right into grad school, she's going to be looking at these colleges and then applying to them immediately and then going. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that's sort of like, you know, the order of things. So she clearly is a very organized and really on it person, which I wouldn't know anything about personally, but I do respect that she is like she was so on target with her goals. Now, her father, Peter, arrives at her apartment and he noticed that not only is her door unlocked, but it's partially open. And I don't think it was like open, like enough to see it with the naked eye. But when you got to the door, you could tell that it was not fully closed. And I assume this is the case because they made a point to say the door was open, but also nobody had called the police or checked on her prior to Peter's coming over. And she did live in an apartment complex, and there will be more about that later. So if the door had been like open, I think somebody would have noticed, would have checked on her, would have called the, management company, maybe even the police, But as it was just barely open and enough to make Peter worry. So he goes inside and he finds what I would not wish on my worst enemy. And that is his 22-year-old daughter, Debbie, dead inside. She's laying face up. She's wearing only a t-shirt and nothing else. So she is naked, mostly, which is fucking horrifying. Her hands and feet are bound with duct tape, and her face is covered in that same tape. The tape is covering both her mouth and her nose so that she could not breathe. And I will just say that this is what killed her, which, to really think about what that is like and what that must have been like is just harrowing. It's awful. Peter immediately ran out of the apartment, found a neighbor to call police. He later said that he knew he had to keep some level of composure to ensure that the police would come quickly. If he'd been like openly losing it, he wouldn't have been, it would have been more difficult for him to communicate what he needed. And also I think he was probably in some amount of shock, to be fair. This is not an easy thing to come upon. So I feel like he was probably having almost like an out-of-body experience. But he later said that he had enough presence of mind to know that he needed, I hit my mic, sorry. He knew that he needed to communicate calmly so that he could get the help he needed as quickly as possible. Now, unfortunately, Debbie was already dead at this point, but I do think that his thought process made a lot of sense. The police come, they find Debbie, and they determine that she had been raped before she died. Now, luckily, there is semen at the scene, which they dutifully collect, which is good because this is 1996. So, DNA is not great, but it exists. So they know to collect this kind of evidence and to hold on to it. This story, of course, makes the news as Debbie was a very pretty young white college student, so perfect for a news story in the 90s. Like I said, this place was overrun with crime, but they definitely pick and choose who they want to sort of highlight, and she was a good candidate for that. And this, of course, terrifies people in the area. Like I said, she doesn't live in a bad area. So for this to happen to her feels particularly traumatizing, I think, for people who live in this city and feel like they've found a safe place to be. And it's just not the case. Police did what they could, and they did work really fast, processing the DNA on the scene to the best of their ability, given, the year's 1996. They took note of a few other things at the apartment, mostly that the door had not been forced open, which unfortunately comes into play later, and we'll talk about that. So they, of course, began looking at anybody who knew Debbie because maybe it was somebody that she let inside deliberately. So that was kind of their thought process in the beginning, but it does have broader implications later. They didn't really get very far with this line of investigation, but about 2 months after her murder, police did arrest a suspect named Maurice Dixon. I hate to admit that I couldn't find hardly any information that explained how they got to the point of arresting him. I think maybe he knew her. I do want to call out that also he was a black man, so it was probably a pretty easy choice. I do also know that his DNA ended up being a partial match to that at the scene. So based on that partial match, he was arrested on suspicion of murder. But about 2 weeks later, and he was in jail the whole time, after taking a more specific DNA test, he was found to definitely not be a match. Now, as I'd mentioned back then, DNA technology was not what it is today. They had multiple tests back then to sort of narrow down suspects, while now we can get exact matches from touch DNA. So the difference is pretty insane. So he took at first what was called a DQ test, which indicated that he might be a match. Now, not every person who takes this test is going to potentially be a match. So that gave police a good starting point. Okay, let's arrest him. Let's detain him. Potentially he knows her. Maybe he was in the area. I don't know. But whatever info they had that got them to this DNA point, the DNA again pointed to him. Now, fortunately for him, but unfortunately for the case, the second test that was much more specific said he definitely was not the perpetrator, and this was a 1 in 3 million kind of deal. So not a match, definitely not a match. So now police are back at square one, and they have no real leads, no suspects. They're pretty much just like at a loss. And pretty quickly, very unfortunately, the case goes cold. And it stays completely cold for 6 years. So now I'm going to talk about a nearby town called Visalia. Visalia is also in California. It's in a different county than Fresno, but not very far away, like maybe 40 miles, which when dealing with rural areas really isn't that far, at least in terms of drive time, because there's not the same kind of traffic that you're going to see in bigger cities. Now, I said 6 years, and we will get there, but as of right now, we're in 1999 in Visalia, which is like not a huge town, but not tiny. And again, surrounded by like farming. It's very rural and does have a decent amount of crime. So it's 1999, and there's a young woman around 18 years old who's riding her bike home from her job at an ice cream store. While riding, she is approached by a man in a hooded jacket who pulls a bandana over her nose, grabs her bike handles, like the handlebars, stops her in the street, and puts a gun into her side. He tells her that he doesn't want to hurt her, but he will if she doesn't do what he says. He then pulls her off of the street into some bushes, or like sort of between them and like a tree, behind the bushes basically, and begins fondling her breasts. He then masturbates onto the street, or sort of does this while he's fondling her, and then runs away. This poor woman, after it's over, goes to her sister's house and tells her what happened, and her sister immediately calls the police. Police arrive on the scene, and they take a DNA sample from the semen on the ground, which is just so gross. It's just awful. And they also get details from the victim. Over the next 4 years, there are another 7 or 8 attacks similar or worse than this one. Now, this includes an attack in January of 2002, where a woman was waiting for a bus, again in Visalia, when she was approached by a man in a hooded jacket who put a gun into her side and fondled her while she stood there terrified. Now, there isn't a ton of information about the other attacks, but I can tell you that they include forced oral copulation, attempted forced oral copulation, rape, sodomy, kidnapping, and other really terrible charges. All of the attacks took place, or most of them took place, or at least started outside in like public locations, but sort of off the beaten path. And all of the victims, except for the woman at the bus stop, were moved to a new location before being assaulted. All of these assaults also involved a gun, a man in a hooded jacket, and often included a bandana. So police are seeing a definite pattern here, but they have no suspect. Finally, in 2002, after this most recent attack, and there is one more after this in 2002, but after this attack that occurred in January, police upload the DNA from the 1999 attack, which they very much believe to be connected to this one, into CODIS. And they get a match. But it's not the type of match that you're thinking. Police, instead of getting a match to a person, they get a match to an unsolved case. And that case is the murder of Debbie Dorian. That's right. Police were able to tie the sexual assault in 1999 to the Debbie Dorian murder in 1996. Now, note that I do not say they found her killer, because that is up for debate, and we'll get into that later. But the presence of semen, unfortunately, does not mean that the person whose semen it belongs to was her killer, and we'll talk about that. However, that little note aside, I think based on the fact that the other location of this DNA was at yet another crime scene, gives us a good idea of the truth and what this guy is about. Now, the hand of justice can be quite slow. So it wasn't until 2009 that police put together a case of 9 charges, or 9 separate cases, against an unknown John Doe perpetrator. This is a pretty uncommon thing, and it was the first time this ever happened in Tulare County, which is where Visalia is located. So they didn't even charge anybody in Debbie's murder at this point, only in these Visalia attacks, even though they knew at least one of the attacks was, connected to her case. They only charged for these attacks. And it's like, how do you file charges against no one? You are only filing them against DNA with the hope that eventually that DNA is going to be linked to a person. Now, I think part of the reason they did this was to drum up leads in the case and to let the perp know that they were not giving up on solving these attacks and that they were actively searching for this guy. Unfortunately, even after this, nothing really happened. Now, 7 years later, in 2016, so 20 years after Debbie's murder, 2 retired detectives who had originally worked on Debbie's case came back onto the case, which was declared reopened. And these 2 men came back on because this was like the case of their lives. They didn't want to see it unsolved. They wanted it to be solved in their lifetimes. So they came out of retirement. They came back to this case. And I believe that this is due to some new information about the case coming up, which apparently was good enough to bring these guys back. But I'll tell you right now, I don't have any specifics on what that was. And again, in just a moment, this will all come together and we'll all kind of know why that is. So the case is reopened. And as I'm sure we all remember, in 2018, a very big case was cracked thanks to the brand new use of genetic genealogy. Now, the case I'm talking about is, of course, the Golden State Killer, or GSK, also known as Earons, the original, or the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. This man had many different names. His legal name is Joseph James DeAngelo, and he was caught for his insanely terrible crimes using familial genealogy. And the way this works, I'm just going to kind of dumb it down. I'm sure most people who know anything about true crime know, but I found a way that kind of, in my opinion, makes it simple to understand. Basically, when police have a DNA profile but nothing to compare it to directly, meaning no matches in CODIS or any other database, they can now start using familial DNA to narrow down their pool of suspects, even if they don't have anybody in mind. So what they can do is they can use the DNA they have and compare it to the DNA people upload online for genealogy purposes. And they use that to figure out who their perp is within a few people. So like if there are 3 brothers, they can narrow it down to the 3, which they've done multiple times at this point. But they narrow it down to like 3 brothers. But then from there, they have to do the legwork to figure out which one it is. And that can be based on like where they were. Or, I mean, you can get a DNA profile from the 3 brothers and only one will perfectly match. So the genealogy gets you like really, really close, but it doesn't get you all the way there. And obviously it's much more complicated than just like going to ancestry.com. Like police can't actually do that. There's a particular kind of database that can be used. So it's not like they're just wilding out with all of our DNA. But for the purposes of explaining how this works, I sort of just simplified. And to be honest, I don't fully understand all of the laws or implications, but I know that essentially that's how it works. So anyway, once GSK is caught using this method, police nationwide did a collective and then started using this to solve other cold cases, including Debbie's case, which also included all of these sexual assaults, rapes, and attacks in Visalia. Now, I do know that they did have this man in mind before they compared his DNA, the suspect. I do not know how or why. And again, I kind of mentioned that. The reason that I don't know how or why is because that information is not yet available, because the trial for this man has not even started now in 2025. That being said, somehow police were alerted to a man who lived in the area at the time of the attacks. Now, this man did not have any DNA in the database, but they used this new method and were able to narrow down their search to his family. And with this information, they were given a search warrant that allowed them to collect DNA from his trash, which they did. And when they did, they found that it was a perfect match not only to the Visalia attack, but to the Debbie Dorian crime scene. So here we have 2 perfect matches between the 2 cases. It's the same guy, and the man is 57-year-old Nicky Stain. And it's Nickey, Stane. And I tell you this because he has active Facebook profiles and an online presence. So if anybody wants to go look and kind of see what this guy's about, you can do that. And I don't really care because fuck this guy. Now, at the time of Debbie's murder, he was a 29-year-old married father of 2 living in Visalia, which is beyond horrifying that is. I mean, there's no good suspect, but like to be doing this shit while you have a wife and kids, it just adds another layer to it. And as far as the attacks, there's a map that shows where they all took place. And wouldn't you know, Nikki's house is not even a mile from most of the Visalia attacks and maybe under 2 miles at most from all of them. So he's just kicking back in his own backyard doing this shit, which is great because it's just another sort of like gotcha for the police, right? Now, once police matched the DNA, they arrested Nicky at his job managing a Charlie's Philly Steaks in a nearby mall. His employees actually had to call the owner of the business to tell him, like, hey, the police just came in and arrested the manager, which was a shock to everybody because he had no record. He seemed like a family man. I think he was twice divorced, but like he was like a very normal guy. Now, things from here get a little bit murky because, again, we're entering into a time where the evidence is still being kind of kept hush-hush because they haven't gone to trial yet. But basically, I've read that at some point he did admit to the attacks in Visalia, but denied having anything to do with Debbie's murder. Now, in other articles, I know that he's pled not guilty to all charges, so I don't know. But what I do know is that this man lived a very dual life. On the one hand, he's a twice divorced father of 2 adult children who has pictures of his extended family on his Facebook page where he posted all sorts of family-friendly content, including, him cooking for his family at all holidays and get-togethers. Now, on the other hand, he had another Facebook page under the name Nick Steele, Steel. This profile is super gross and includes all sorts of honestly pathetic posts trying to pick up random women. It's such an old person on Facebook move to post sexy posts on your own timeline as if you're talking to an audience when nobody's reading any of it. It's just it's almost like I would feel bad for him if he wasn't who he was. Now, on one of his gross posts, he posts a fireplace he apparently had installed in his bedroom. Barf. And in another, he's talking about finding someone to go have drinks with, which again, barf. Criminal psychologists interviewed about this case said actually that having this sort of dual life is really common for criminals who have sexual motivation to their crimes. They have this dual life and they're just sort of narcissistic enough to think that they can get away with it. So this guy is just ticking all the boxes that point to guilty. I mean, we've got DNA, but even beyond that, we've got the proximity. We've got these weird dual Facebooks. We've got just, he just seems gnarly. So he was arrested on my birthday, January 29th, 2020, which I love for him and for me. His trial has not officially started, but I do note that the pre-trial hearings to determine if he'll be charged have taken place. And as of October of 2024, they were still kind of ongoing when a judge finally decided to allow all of these cases to be tried together. Now, prior to that, there had been multiple hearings where victims and witnesses, including Debbie's father, testified in order to determine if Nicky should be charged for the sex crimes and the murder, and also if they should be charged together. One of his victims, one of the women who'd been fondled, I believe the first one from 1999, took the stand and talked about how the attack forever changed her life, how she lives in fear that she'll be attacked again. She also talked about how the assault felt like it lasted forever. This has been, over 20 years of her life that feels like they've been stolen from her, which is very, very sad. Debbie's father also says, he has the day he found her body burned into his memory, which I fully believe. And he recounted that in precise detail while on the stand. Now, another witness also came forward, and this was Debbie's neighbor. Now, this neighbor saw Nicky Stain knock on Debbie's door 2 nights before her body was found. He also saw her open the door to Nicky. Whether or not she let him in wasn't discussed in what I read, but I can tell you that he positively identified Nikki as the man at the house, pointing him out in the courtroom and saying, yes, that is the man that I saw at her apartment that night. And this very well could be the last time anybody saw Debbie alive. And it also tracks with the timeline of her having been dead for 2 days. She didn't go to work during that time. Nobody had heard from her. And then her father had to come and find her body. So everything aligns timeline-wise as well. Now, the first hearing ended and the judge decided that Stain could be charged with all of these together. The second hearing came and went, and that judge ruled that he could be tried. Oh, sorry. The first one was to determine if he could be charged at all. They said yes. The second one was to determine if he could be tried together, which his attorney said would get in the way of him getting a fair trial due to all of the emotion. But it really seems like nobody cares about that because we have DNA evidence, eyewitness testimony, living victims. I mean, it feels like a very slam dunk case. That being said, Stain's team is going with the defense that he and Debbie did in fact know each other and that on the night of her murder or sometime just prior to her murder, they had consensual sex, but he was not the one to kill her and apparently wasn't there when she died. His attorney won't give any details, but does say that there's proof they were not strangers, which is cryptic and concerning because if they have proof of that, I still don't think it's going to do enough, especially since, they have proof that he attacked at least one other woman. So it feels still not that important, but it certainly could be. And it's definitely intriguing. So I'm interested to see. I'm going to keep an eye on this case. But I did want to say, even if she did know him, that could actually lend credibility to the idea that he killed her after attacking her. Because right now it's honestly kind of weird that he killed her, but hasn't, at least as far as we know, killed anybody else. Or as far as we know, killed anybody before her. Because it's very uncommon for a criminal to start their career with a crime like this. I mean, it does happen, but my thought process is that maybe he killed her to avoid getting caught because she knew him. Whereas these other women have no idea who he was. So he covers his face up enough, attacks them, and then he doesn't have to kill them because they're not going to be able to identify him. They can't say for sure it was him. And he only left DNA at the one crime scene, which is a good thing he did because it tied him. That's kind of what got him. But anyway, that's my kind of thought process. It's like if he did actually know her, in a way that makes it more likely that it gives him a motive to kill her, essentially. So I'm interested to see how that sort of line of defense is going to work out or potentially backfire. For now, though, that's all I really have. This is an active case with, only a suspect. He's not officially the perpetrator. I'll be sure to update once we know how things end up. I know this is a little bit of a shorter case this week, but I found it really interesting and I found it to be frustrating that this man was able to attack these women for so long and that he was never caught. It just goes to show that there's a lot of crime in Central California. It can be a scary place. It can be a scary place. I want to eventually cover, there was like a serial killer in some like areas around there that, he killed people for like years and years and he was finally caught like a couple years ago. But the case is really interesting because it's all like gang activity in these areas, which I don't think people think about gang activity in like farming communities, but it's actually very prevalent in California. And part of that is why he got away with it for so long. But anyway, I'll cover that case eventually. For now, I just want to kind of finish talking about Debbie, because I think it's really horrible that she was killed so young. She was clearly a very intelligent, driven, smart, hardworking young woman. And I think it's really awful that it's taken this long, 30 years almost, for her family to potentially see justice. I'm glad that her parents are still alive to see this case go to trial. And I promise you guys, I will update you once we have a resolution or if anything else of interest happens with this case. And again, I want to mix in these smaller lesser known cases, because I think it's important to cover true crime that maybe hasn't been done 100 times, to talk about victims who maybe don't get the same exposure, especially when their cases aren't solved. So I hope everybody enjoys this. If you feel like making yourself sick to your stomach, feel free to look at this guy's Facebook pages. They're horrible. Guy's a loser. But yeah, I'll update once we have a resolution to this case, and I'll be back next week with another case. Thanks to all my new listeners. You guys are amazing. I really appreciate you guys. I promise I'm going to be keep putting out content every week. There won't be skipped weeks unless, I've got the flu or something horrible. I want everybody to... I hate having to wait for podcasts. I hate when they don't post for like weeks at a time. It makes me insane. So I promise not to do that to you guys. And please like, rate, review, share with your friends and family. Join me on Instagram. And until next week, everybody stay safe and have a nice week. Stay out of the wind if you're anywhere near me. Bye.